Today's trigger warnings are for rape, sexual assault, rape apologetics, child sex abuse, physical violence, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, and aphobia. So, this is a little awkward. For those of you who don't know, which I suspect is not many of you, I have some connections to Lily Orchard. While we haven't interacted much directly, she kicked off my YouTube channel by sharing a video I made in defense of her, and she was a huge inspiration to me when I was first starting out. A lot of you watching right now probably subscribed primarily because I mimicked her style. But more than that, Lily has had a profound impact on my personal life, most notably in that I met one of my closest friends through her. So, understand that today's video isn't made for clout, or fame, or drama, or out of spite. I'm making it because I genuinely believe this is the right thing to do. Today, we'll primarily be discussing Lily Orchard's statement on Tara Reade's allegations against Joe Biden, and before I go any further, I'd just like to thank my friend Peter/Ethel from Essence of Thought for helping me research and report on this extremely complex issue. And I'd like to thank an anonymous subscriber for bringing the issue to my attention. So let's have a look at Orchard's statement. She says that the allegations against Biden were investigated, that, quote, very little, unquote, came of these investigations, that Reade has changed her story more than once, and that Reade has a fixation with Vladimir Putin. She then links an article called The Troublesome Tara Reade Story written by Joan Walsh of The Nation. Finally, she ends with a cryptic statement that I'm assuming is a reference to Hillary Clinton's email scandal, which is apparently relevant somehow. It's also important to note that, at time of writing, this statement is roughly a week old, so that would be the 24th of April 2020 at the latest. Yeah, I know, it's taken me way too long to get this video out. I've been going through some stuff. Anyway, looking at Orchard's statement, it's vague and sloppy. A lot of assertions are made without backing, and the exact nature of those assertions is mostly left up to interpretation, primarily the significance of Reade's thoughts on Putin. In most cases, I take issue with this sort of coy defamation. When talking about a rape allegation, however, it's absolutely, unquestioningly unacceptable. And on that note, I have 6 questions that I think will help us understand exactly what went wrong here. 1. Which details of her story did Reade change, and how do these changes cast doubt on her allegations? 2. What, if anything, came of the investigation into Reade's allegations, and do these findings corroborate or contradict her testimony? 3. Who conducted the investigation into Reade's allegations, and did they have a relevant bias? 4. Is the troublesome Tara Reade story consistent with other sources? 5. Does the author or publication responsible for the troublesome Tara Reade story have a relevant bias? And 6. What relevance does Putin, or Reade's opinion of him, have to these allegations? Before we start to answer these questions though, we need an understanding of Tara Reade's story, so I draw your attention to a transcription of an interview she had with Katie Halper titled Tara Reade Tells Her Story. During that interview, Tara describes several scenarios. She describes a pattern of sexual harassment from Biden, of him touching her shoulders, hair and neck, and otherwise making her feel like an object. She describes an incident when she was told Biden wanted her to serve drinks at a fundraising event because, quote, he thinks you're pretty and that you have nice legs, unquote. She describes her supervisor, a woman, attempting to gaslight and intimidate her into silence more than once, telling her that she ought to feel complimented by Biden's behavior and what it meant, and that she needed to stay quiet if she wanted to keep her job. She describes other workers telling her to dress less provocatively, and all of a sudden constantly finding fault with her work. She describes other workers asking her why she isn't glad to have Biden's attention. She describes the rape, of course. I won't recount it here, but I will say that it is detailed. She describes what the weather was like, and what she was wearing, and how her legs hurt from walking on the marble of the Capitol building in heels, and she describes what she was thinking at the time and her impression of Biden's reaction. Not all of this information is important to answering our questions, but it will be important, so do bear with me. For now, first question. Which details of Tara Reade's story did she change, and how do these changes cast doubt on her allegations? According to Orchard's source, there's only one true contradiction. Apparently, Reade couldn't remember which supervisor told her that she'd need to find a new job. This is not only a detail that I think it's reasonable enough to misremember after 27 years, but this has nothing to do with the sexual assault. You can assume she was outright lying about this, and the sexual assault could have still happened. That's how tenuous the connection is. Aside from that, all these contradictions, all these changes in her story, are in fact Reade telling us about some incidents, but not others, or leaving certain details out of her story that she wasn't comfortable sharing. This isn't strange. As Anthony Zencas explains in his piece, The Inconvenient Truth of Rape, traumatic memories tend to be recalled in pieces. Time and place can be distorted. Traumatic memories tend to be recalled in pieces. Time and place can be distorted. Innocuous details can stand out. Many of the more important details are forgotten, and often it takes time for the full story to be revealed. Zencas even notes the story of one survivor who began with reports of sexual assault over her clothes, only to report rape later on, just like Reade. And that's not even getting into the emotional barriers that keep people from reporting even when they remember what happened. Barriers such as difficulty with reliving the traumatic memory, exhaustion at the thought of dealing with everyone's reactions, or fear of the negative consequences that could come from speaking out. And I do need to make it clear that survivors deal with trauma and coming out in many different ways, and that this pattern doesn't apply to everyone. For example, it doesn't really apply to me. But my point is that Reade's behaviour isn't at all suspect. Inconsistencies in her story, or gaps in her story, or her decision to disclose only part of her story, are completely understandable and do not cast a doubt on her allegations. But that's not the way a lot of people seem to be telling it, so let's move on to question 2. What, if anything, came of the investigation into Reade's allegations, and do these findings corroborate or contradict her testimony? Before we can answer that, however, we need to find the investigation in question. Luckily, Orchard Source provides us with 2 links. While one link only leads us to a dead Washington Post page, the other leads us to a New York Times article called Examining Tara Reade's Sexual Assault Allegation Against Joe Biden. It seems the investigation involves interviews with Reade, her lawyers, the friends and family she confided in, the 7 other women who came forward with accusations against Biden, and almost 24 people who worked for Biden at the time of the alleged assault. It's actually a lot more thorough than I expected. And the conclusion? Quote, "No other allegation about sexual assault surfaced in the course of reporting, nor did any former Biden staff members corroborate any details of Ms. Reade's allegation. The Times found no pattern of sexual misconduct by Mr. Biden." Unquote. So, how am I going to argue with that? Well, as ironclad as this seems, we do need to keep a couple of things in mind here. First of all, Biden's former staffers say they don't recall any kind of sexual harassment or hostile work environment in 1993. Now, I personally haven't been to 1993, but I've spoken to women who've been there, and I've read the accounts of women who've been there, and let's just say that 1993 was somehow even less hospitable to women than the sexist hellscape we currently live in. For example, if you were paying attention to my summary of Reade's account, you might have noticed that her workplace wasn't exactly supportive of her and what she was going through. What we would now see as blatant sexual harassment and victim blaming were the norm at the time, and I would not be the least bit surprised if these people, many of them men, had seen it and simply failed to notice it because it was normal to them. We also have to consider that these are former staffers of a man who's currently running for President of the United States. There are political motivations that could be keeping them silent. Either they have a desire to remain in Biden's good graces, they fear earning his ire, or perhaps they just don't want a reputation as a troublemaker. Not to mention that Biden has some degree of immunity due to his position. Time's Up already refused to help Reade for political reasons, so it's not inconceivable that Biden's former staffers would be under some kind of political pressure as well. As much as people are intent on ignoring it, the simple fact is, political power does give you special privileges that no person should have, including being above the law. We also have to consider that Biden's former staffers have a lot to lose personally if Reade is believed. She describes them engaging in some extremely nasty behaviour that they might not want to admit to even themselves, never mind being branded with it publicly. Also, the article was doctored. You can ignore all those arguments I just made. I was messing with you. The article was doctored. Here, have a screenshot of the New York Times original quote. Quote, "We found no pattern of sexual misconduct by Biden beyond hugs, kisses, and touching that women previously said made them uncomfortable." Unquote. Now, you might be wondering why exactly the article was doctored, and I'm glad I pretended you asked. See, it's because the Biden campaign wanted it. Obviously. Where the hell have you been? It was either going to be the Biden campaign or someone who benefited from the Biden campaign. That's just how politics work. In this case, it was just the Biden campaign casually asking for a cover-up, and the Times doing it. Quote, "I think the campaign thought the phrasing was awkward, and made it look like there were other instances in which he'd been accused of sexual misconduct." Unquote. Yet, no. If a sentence is phrased awkwardly, but contains very important information, you rephrase that sentence, you don't just cut it out. If a sentence is unclear, but contains very important information, you rephrase that sentence, you don't just cut it out. I put more effort than this into editing my own scripts, for goodness sake. This wasn't editing, it was a cover-up. And I just need to take a moment to note that, while the tweet I used to evidence this cover-up is more recent than Orchard's statement, the evidence of the article being doctored, if not the evidence of the Biden campaign's involvement, is not. So please don't accuse me of being unfair. Thank you. Anyway, while the investigation didn't turn up, or rather the New York Times reports that the investigation didn't turn up direct evidence of rape committed by Joe Biden, it did turn up confirmation of a pattern of sexual misconduct by him and evidence of political biases against Tara Reade and the other women who've accused Biden. Given that, I think we can skip question 3, so on to question 4. Is the troublesome Tara Reade story consistent with other sources? There's just so much to say about this article beyond a simple fact check. Okay, let me start with a fact check. As far as I can tell, nothing in the article strays into the territory of outright falsehoods, but a lot of it is phrased in an uncharitable, convoluted, and obscure way. For example, they claim that Reade reported sexual harassment to her supervisors at the time, but that all of them vehemently deny hearing any such complaint. The author doesn't provide any quotes, and they don't even cite their source for this claim beyond saying it was an Associated Press article. By contrast, upon tracking down and reading the Associated Press article, I found that they made the much softer claim that, of the 5 former staffers they spoke to, none recall such an incident or report. They also state that neither Toner nor Kaufman even remembered Reade. I know that factually there isn't a huge difference between these claims beyond the Nation article condensing everything down, but as a writer, I can see how this was written in a specific tone for the sake of guiding people towards a specific conclusion. By bringing up recollections, the Associated Press, whether intentionally or not, is reminding us that memory is ultimately ephemeral, and that there's a disconnect between perceptions and reality. Their reporting leaves room for doubt and questioning. A vehement denial, however, evokes both certainty and anger. It shuts down questions and discussions and challenges. Additionally, the Associated Press article provides quotes where the Nation article does not. Even if you want to be critical of the Nation, there's nothing to be critical of. You can either take their word for it, or assume that they're mistaken, or assume that they're lying. And that's it. Building on this theme of the Associated Press leaving room for doubt, if we look at another article from them, we can see that they quote Reade saying that she was too scared to write about the sexual assault. The Nation article, by contrast, refuses to even say the word afraid. They seriously try to pretend that they genuinely believe that someone accusing a senator of rape has no reason to be scared of anything. In fact, the Nation refuses to entertain any possible explanation for any issue they take with Reade or her evidence other than her lying. Now, I do take issue with the Associated Press's reporting. As much as I made it sound like they covered this neutrally, the truth is, they didn't. While they're too cowardly to attack Reade directly, they use the testimony of Biden's former staffers to do the heavy lifting for them, while they simply look the other way. For example, they allow Baker's statement to pass unchallenged, despite the fact that it's obviously false. When's the last time you heard of a workplace with no inappropriate conduct whatsoever? Never mind a workplace in 1993. Then, not 2 paragraphs later, they fail to question why Toner and Kaufman say they don't remember Reade when we know she worked with them. They never bring up Biden's well-established pattern of sexual misconduct either. While Reade is expected to have a seer-like memory and physical evidence to back it up, while her every claim is treated as dubious, the people who disagree with her are taken at their word no matter how suspect or unlikely their claims are. But, for all the Associated Press's faults, at least they pretend to be neutral. The same can't be said of The Nation. After reading both articles, I genuinely believe that the only reason The Nation didn't provide a link to the Associated Press is because an article that's only 90% rape apologetics just wasn't good enough for them. The Nation article is also just nakedly and unashamedly pushing a political agenda. In addition to making a point of mentioning that Reade's story originated on the left, and of introducing Katie Halper as diehard Bernie Sanders supporter Katie Halper, for absolutely no reason that they cared to explain, there's an entire paragraph dedicated to pointing out that Reade has said nice things about Vladimir Putin. They say this only to admit that her opinions on Putin have nothing to do with her credibility. I have to ask these people, if her opinions on Putin are irrelevant, then what the hell are they doing here? They're just poisoning the well. And just to be clear, I'm not admonishing them for discussing the influence of politics on this whole situation. I really wish more people would. I'm admonishing them for prioritizing their political analysis over their analysis of the case. And I'm admonishing them for their double standard in using politics to insinuate that individual voters are biased, all while they pretend that former staffers of a man who's currently running for President of the United States have no reason to let politics take precedence over truth. I'm admonishing them for using politics as a tool to attack a survivor of rape. This article claims to report on reasons to doubt Tara Reade, but the author seems a lot more interested in waffling on about utter nonsense than actually engaging with the facts of the case. If I cut out the copious fluff, all this article gets around to saying is, some people deny Reade's claims, and we can't find record of some things. That's literally it. They never even discuss or analyze any of it, just, some people say she's wrong, and some records are absent. And when they're finally forced to admit that there are people and records corroborating Reade's story, what do? Do they consider for a moment that they could be wrong? Do they take the time to discuss this new evidence? No. They jump straight to the weakest link, in the fact that her brother doesn't have perfect recollections of the story, and he hasn't talked to every outlet that's asked him to make a statement. And they take that as proof that everything must be completely false, as if the testimony and behaviour of Reade's brother somehow overrides her own. I detect a hint of misogyny. I'd also like to add that nowhere, not once in this article, do the words, "now you may argue," appear. There are exactly 0 rebuttals. They adamantly refuse to engage. This is not an expository piece. It's a piece consisting of nitpicking and radical doubt, where the most uncertain elements of the case are highlighted to the exclusion of all else. And the fact that they aren't 100% certain is taken as proof, not even evidence, but proof, that Reade must be lying. It's completely unreasonable, dishonest, biased trash. And that there answers questions 4 and 5, so what about question 6? What relevance does Putin, or Reade's opinion of him, have to these allegations? Well, put simply, none. Absolutely none. And I will explain why, but first we need to talk a little bit about rape culture. Then we can start bringing all of this together. So what is rape culture? From Marshall University's Women's Center, quote, "Rape culture is an environment in which rape is prevalent and in which sexual violence against women is normalized and excused in the media and popular culture," unquote. Now, you might be skeptical of that. You might be thinking, what the hell are you talking about, Levi? No one does that, Levi. Everyone agrees that rape is bad. And hear me out. The reason you think that is because rape culture works. When people excuse rape, you don't see it as making excuses because it's been normalized. And I can prove that. A personal example. On Twitter, I talked about an incident when I was in school, and I had a man ask if he could sit on my lap. In response, I was told that you can't control other people, and that I should have solved the situation by fighting back. And I just want to take a moment to appreciate the fact that the man in question, who was so sure that he understood the situation and knew exactly what to do, put so little thought and effort into his response that he didn't even get my story right. Yes, I am a bit salty. Let's break down what happened here. Imagine if someone told you that an adult, unprovoked, threatened to hit them when they were in school. And imagine telling them that you can't change other people and that you should have fought back. It's unthinkable, isn't it? Obviously, fighting back isn't an option for a lot of people. A lot of children, even in their teenage years, are smaller than adults and would lose in a physical confrontation. A lot of schools crack down hard on violence, even in self-defense, so many students would fear retribution. A lot of children don't know their rights. They might not think that they have the right to stand up for themselves, and they might not even know that their rights are being violated in the first place. And a lot of people, even adults, would simply be too stunned to react. What this man thought he was doing was helping arm potential victims with the knowledge they needed to protect themselves. And I know that because he said as much when I called him out. What this man is actually doing is blaming victims. He's pretending the problem is easy to solve so that he can pretend it's not a problem that requires collective support and intervention. He's putting the onus on me so that he can pretend that people like him aren't complicit. And he's denying the agency of the perpetrator and the faculty of the school so that he doesn't have to question whether or not people like him are complicit. And it's so bizarre, his logic, because according to him, sexual violence is somehow impossible for us to challenge as a society or as a community, but it's so incredibly easy for individuals to protect ourselves against that we should be talked down to and berated when it happens to us. And it's so bizarre that he says you can't change other people, only to go back on this when it comes time to blame the victim, the child victim, for failing to make the perpetrator change. This is rape culture. And let me talk a little bit more about the incident itself. I was 14 at the time. 14. Pre-transition, so for all intents and purposes, I was a girl. I was waiting in the front office, and there was a woman at the counter, as there usually was. She saw everything. She heard everything. So, what did she do? Did she call for the man to be removed from the premises? Did she call for the principal or the police? Did she file a report so that this man could be registered as a sex offender? Did she, at the very least, look at this man like he'd grown a second head? No. She looked at me with a look that said, "Oh, isn't that gross? But that's just how men are, sweetie." I was already completely stunned by what happened. I didn't know what to do or even entirely what to think. I knew it was wrong. I knew that much, but I didn't know how wrong until it was too late to do anything. I looked to this woman for guidance and protection, thinking that she would understand, and she did. She understood that it was normal, and I just had to put up with it. She normalized it for him and for herself and for me. This is rape culture. This is rape culture being passed down from one generation to the next by the very people who are hurt by it. And we also have to consider what the perpetrator did, or rather what he didn't do. See, he played off what he said as a joke, and he'd very much like you to believe that it was just a joke, that it wasn't malicious and predatory. But if it were just a joke, don't you think he would have felt some remorse when he realized that it wasn't funny to me? I don't mean to imply that an apology makes up for sexually harassing a child, because it absolutely doesn't. But an apology is the natural response when you realize you've done something wrong, if for no other reason than to ease your own conscience. And he didn't apologize. This man genuinely thought it was okay for him to hurt me. This is rape culture. And it's so pervasive and insidious and so well protected that I'm not confident I've even managed to convince you that it's real. We do not take sexual violence seriously as a culture, but we tell ourselves that we do. And for a lot of people, those are the same thing. Perhaps you doubt me because I've been explaining this through anecdotes, so I've linked a page from Brandon University that discusses rape culture, and also hosts a brilliant video by Blue Seat Studios where common responses to rape are applied to murder. And these are common, arguably archetypical responses, so you can't dismiss them as isolated incidents. For a particularly chilling example, at one point, the character says, "Well, he just felt like ending James's life, and he did, but he's not like a murderer." The fact that we can say that about rapists, but not murderers, that's definitive proof of rape culture. I've been saying for years that we as a society believe that rape is the worst possible thing. But it's really not that big a deal if you sexually touch someone without their consent. Society is against a word, not the thing it represents, so when someone is raped or otherwise sexually violated, we immediately start devoting all of our energy into proving that technically what happened doesn't fall under the definition of this one bad word. Actually, have you heard of the narcissist's prayer? It didn't happen. And if it did, it wasn't that bad. And if it was, that's not a big deal. And if it is, that's not my fault. And if it was, I didn't mean it. And if I did, you deserved it. That's our society's approach to sexual violence in a nutshell. And of course, this is an incomplete explanation. Rape culture is complicated and multifaceted, but hopefully this is enough for us to understand what's happening here. So, what does this have to do with Putin? Well, if I assume the argument is being made honestly, then it goes like this. Tara Reade is lying about being raped by Biden in order to forward her political agenda, and we know she has said political agenda because of her writings on Putin. The problem with this? Well, one problem is to do with innocent until proven guilty. A lot of people like to trot out this argument when men are accused of rape. We can't assume he did it. Haven't you heard of innocent until proven guilty? And here's the thing. If you're going to go that route, then you also have to agree that Tara Reade is innocent of lying until she's proven guilty. This argument does not assume that Tara Reade is innocent of lying. In fact, not only does it assume she's guilty of lying, but I'm pretty sure it also assumes that she's guilty of conspiracy against the federal government. How do I know that? Well, her views on Putin are only relevant if she specifically made false rape allegations for the purpose of undermining Biden to further her political agenda. So, her views cannot be relevant if she's telling the truth, or if she's lying but for another reason, or even if she is pursuing a conviction for the sake of her political agenda, but also telling the truth. You would have to specifically assume that she's doing this solely to interfere with the election for her views on Putin to be relevant. And you might argue that I'm being unfair, because people aren't saying she's definitely lying to forward her political agenda, they're just discussing every possibility. But that isn't how the discussion goes at all. In fact, there never is a discussion. When's the last time you heard someone break down, in detail, exactly how Reade's accusations are supposed to forward a political agenda and what that political agenda is? How do they explain the evidence that does exist and, according to them, must necessarily be fake? They don't. They just say, oh, well, she has some interesting views on Putin. And it just hangs there. This is just another version of what were they wearing. When someone asks that, it has nothing to do with anything. It's not meant to make sense. It's not like people suddenly start taking things seriously when you say, actually, she was wearing a long skirt and a dorky jumper. They're just trying to find an excuse to divert attention from the perpetrator and focus it onto being critical of the victim. It's exactly what that man did to me on Twitter. It's exactly what people are doing when they bring up Putin. It's the first thing that happens to anyone who speaks up about any kind of sexual violence. It's classic rape culture. In fact, let's extend the murder analogy from before to this situation. Imagine someone saying, look, I know Biden has a well-documented history of hitting people with baseball bats, but we haven't seen him murder anyone before, so there's no way he did. Look, I know one woman claims that he tried to beat her to death in an alley, but she's a Trump supporter, so she's obviously lying for political gain. Do you see the obvious problems with that? And that's not the only problem with this conspiracy theory. Let's just pretend for a moment that we know for 100% sure that Reade was lying about these allegations for the sake of forwarding her political agenda. What does the world look like? We have evidence corroborating her story, even if we assume she recently asked her friends and family to lie and they decided to do so because they apparently also really liked Putin. That doesn't explain the call Reade's mother made to the Larry King show at the time. And yes, news of that didn't break until shortly after my estimate of when Orchard made her statement, but I'm still using it to make my point to all of you. In light of that call, you would either have to assume that Reade's been setting this up since 1993, that she convincingly lied to her family about being sexually assaulted just in case Biden happened to run for president at some point, or at best that she's repurposing an actual incident of rape, and given her mother's statement on the Larry King show, it would have to be an incident of rape by a prominent senator other than Biden. You would also have to assume that Biden's former staffers are covering up this other rape, and with it, the very clear evidence that Reade is lying about Biden. Unless you also want to assume that Reade made no effort to address the pattern of sexual harassment she endured at her workplace that would have preceded such a rape. Unless you also want to assume that there was no pattern of sexual harassment, that the rape was entirely spontaneous, and that Reade embellished her story with details she knew could not be corroborated. The assumptions to justify this ridiculous hypothesis just keep piling up. And without knowing about the call, as Lily didn't, without assuming she was setting this up since 1993, you'd have to believe the even more ridiculous lie that Reade managed to get her family and friends involved in a pro-Putin, anti-Biden plot somehow, and that she decided to undermine her own plot by embellishing her story with claims of complaints and reports that she would have to know don't exist. The assumptions to justify this ridiculous hypothesis just keep piling up. And this evil master plan isn't even working. Biden's still in the running. In order to accuse Tara Reade of lying, you would have to believe that she lacks the awareness to know that our society does not care about rape and that this would end badly. Which doesn't make sense, because she described rape culture in her workplace and she couldn't bring herself to come forward with the whole story until she absolutely had to. The assumptions to justify this ridiculous hypothesis contradict themselves. But what do you have to assume in order to believe that Biden did it? You have to assume that his well-documented pattern of sexual misconduct is in fact indicative of a pattern, You have to believe that his former staffers, who have careers in politics, might possibly have political motivations that could cause them to lie, and you have to believe that something happening 27 years ago could result in some lost records and some slight misremembering. But everyone stubbornly refuses to believe that, because the idea of holding a man accountable for a rape he definitely committed is inconceivable to them. And I can prove it. Just look at the case of Brock Turner. We know he raped Chanel Miller because he was caught doing it. His guilt was beyond dispute. So instead, it was argued, among other things, that he shouldn't be sentenced because his life would be ruined. It didn't matter that he was a rapist if holding him accountable for the rape he committed had some negative outcome for him. And the same has happened for Biden. Even if we had incontrovertible evidence that Biden raped Reade, people would just say what they've been saying this whole time. But if he drops out of the running, you're just giving the country to Trump. In fact, we don't even need incontrovertible evidence of rape, because we have the elephant in the room. This whole time, everyone's been acting like, if we can just prove Biden didn't rape Tara Reade, then he's in the clear. But he's not. Sexual assault is still a crime, and we have photo and video evidence. This isn't a defense of Biden's innocence, because everyone knows he's not fucking innocent. So instead, they do the only thing they can to get him out of trouble. They make a threat. They say, yes, this man may have very well raped someone. Yes, this man has sexually assaulted dozens of women and children. But bad things will happen if you don't let him get away with it. Do you get it now? Do you understand just how violent you have to be to accuse Tara Reade of lying? This is why I can't defend Lily Orchard anymore. This is what makes Lily Orchard a rape apologist. But the truth is, I've been sitting on a video like this, denouncing Lily Orchard, for a while now. The rape apologetics just forced me to hurry it up. So let's talk about FantasyGate. FantasyGate is my name for an incident from September of last year when Lily declared war on the fantasy genre. A lot of people in her community, just like a lot of people outside her community, liked fantasy. And sometimes they talked about fantasy. And sometimes they shared their fantasy stories. And sometimes they asked Lily for her opinions on their story ideas. And Lily didn't like any of that. But instead of handling this situation like an adult, and just ignoring it because it's just a fact of life that your interests won't always mesh with the interests of everyone in your audience, and it's actually none of your goddamn business what they like, Lily took it upon herself to correct this failing that she thought certain segments of her community had. She launched a writing contest to get people out of their comfort zone, which isn't a terrible idea per se, but, well, just look at the rules for this writing contest. It starts off okay with a setting, genre, word limit and prompt, basic stuff for a writing contest, but then it keeps going. Both characters are cis women. The relationship must be FF. You may not take the story beyond the village. There is no homophobia or gender discrimination in the village. The two must remain together by the end of the story. No steampunk or magitech. These rules aren't just incredibly discouraging and restrictive to a writer's creativity and personal expression. They're bigoted. There was absolutely no reason for Lily to ban stories focusing on non-romantic partnerships involving aromantic people, or poly relationships, or romances involving non-binary people, or romances involving men. There was no reason for it. There was just as much justification for this as there is when straight, cis people insist on keeping all LGBT+ people out of fiction. And it felt exclusionary. I felt extremely excluded as a gay man when I found out that I couldn't write a romance between two men. I felt left out as a trans person when I saw that trans people weren't allowed to be the main characters in the story. I was upset that I couldn't write non-binary rep for my non-binary friends who are constantly starving for representation. I have one friend who literally couldn't participate in the contest because being asexual and aromantic made it impossible for them to write romance. This contest didn't fit with Lily's stated goal of getting people to consider writing other genres. It did the opposite, all while bringing a sense of hostility to most of the LGBT+ people in her community. It did the opposite, all while bringing a sense of hostility to most of her community. And that's because her goal was a lie. She didn't actually want to encourage the writers in her community to expand their horizons beyond fantasy. She wanted to force them to switch from writing fantasy to writing lesbian romances because she likes lesbian romances. In the end, the writing contest was abruptly shut down, not because people called her out for her draconian, bigoted, abusive, and frankly bizarre behaviour, but because she decided that too many people were asking for clarification of her rules. And I would sympathise with her in that regard, if it weren't for the fact that she tends to be extremely strict and unforgiving, and some of her rules were rather vague. I can't fault anyone for wanting to know exactly where her arbitrary boundaries lay, given that the alternative is risking disqualification of their hard work on a technicality. In other words, this is a rod Lily made for her own damn back. And the real kicker? Lily loves fantasy. She's constantly talking about Star Wars and World of Warcraft and My Little Pony. She's writing a comic that takes place in the Pokemon world. She loves fantasy. But for some reason, when her community does it, it's disgusting and horrible and boring and not allowed. FantasyGate might seem trivial to you, but it shows the high degree of control Lily expects to have over the people in her community and the unethical ways she abuses that control. Let's look at another example of her abuse. So the context for this is, apparently, Lily abruptly ended a stream one day and some people thought they could hear crying just before the stream cut out. In response, someone, understandably, asked her if she was okay through Tumblr, and she told them to mind your own business. Someone else argued that fans aren't allowed to be concerned apparently, to which she replied that I'm not allowed to set boundaries apparently. The problem? She didn't set a boundary. Or at least, she didn't just set a boundary. Setting a boundary means telling someone that they're doing something you're not comfortable with, so that they stop. That's literally it. So if Lily's goal were to set a boundary, it would not only be sufficient, but it'd also be more effective if she'd said something like, I'd rather not talk about it, or I want to be left alone for the moment. But Lily's goal wasn't just to set a boundary. She also wanted to lash out. She wanted to be aggressive. She wanted to punish someone for doing something she didn't like, despite the fact that they had no way of knowing she'd take issue with it. This is, unfortunately, a pattern of behaviour for Lily. I remember when I was in her community, I constantly felt like I was walking on eggshells around her, because she could never just tell someone that they were doing something wrong. She had to go straight to abuse almost every time. And her definition of wrong was completely unrealistic too. I can understand her getting angry at people who, for example, broach sensitive and serious topics with all the grace of a flamingo carrying a bowling ball. But that's not the only thing she cracks down on. Now, I'm not willing to show you evidence of everything I've seen, because people have raised concerns that anyone I use as an example could be made an example of, so take this or leave it, but she's yelled at people for liking things that she personally dislikes. She's deleted different opinions from her Discord and shut down discussions. And I'm not talking about discussions around things like race and LGBT+ issues where different opinion is usually code for attack. I'm talking about light and respectful discussions of tropes and characters and plot. Despite making it her job to discuss and analyze media, Lily hates people discussing and analyzing media. Lily has yelled at people for wasting her time by telling her things that they weren't aware she'd already been told, and she acts like her instructions for people are universal despite the fact that a lot of her instructions are in old Tumblr posts or old streams that she chooses to make unavailable. But worst of all, Lily rarely tolerates people talking back, so when she's wrong or she's gone too far, there's nothing you can do about it unless you want to put yourself in the line of fire. A lot of people in her community learn to be very meek and quiet. And I imagine, if she were to respond to this, she'd contest it by pointing to some example of someone calling her out and of her listening. But that is the exception that proves the rule. What makes Lily's behaviour so toxic is that you know there's a chance of her being perfectly amicable just as much as you know it's unlikely. If she were aggressive and violent all the time, you might pick up on the pattern and leave, but since she's nice some of the time, you assume that's the problem is with you. That you just don't understand her particular brand of reasonable well enough. So you keep listening to everything she says and trying your hardest to follow all of her instructions, hoping that someday you'll finally get it and you'll win her approval. And it's not just Lily doing this either, by the way. The dirtbag left is practically built on this whole song and dance. And you know what the secret is? The dirty secret that they don't want you to know? They're not smarter than you. You think they're smarter than you, because they can always explain in great detail why they're right. But that's not intelligence, it's persuasion. Lily Orchard is the sort of person who can sell you sand in the desert, and I wish she were doing something that innocuous, but instead, she sells you the lie that it is okay for her to verbally and emotionally abuse you if you don't read her mind and do everything her way without question. I defended Lily Orchard because she'd genuinely been wronged. But what I failed to appreciate is that, in defending her, I was legitimizing her. And now that I understand the full extent of her behavior and the damage it does, I can't defend Lily Orchard anymore. I hate to think that there's a possibility, however small, that someone joined her community because of my videos. To anyone who was hurt by my hubris and naivete, I'm sorry.